Hi, Mark, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on German politics. And today I need to talk about the current controversies around migration policies in Germany. The number of people entering Germany without permission is increasing, and there are bottlenecks when it comes to accommodating refugees. The federal government is therefore facing growing pressure here. And time is pressing because of the upcoming European elections next year and loud complaints from local authorities and the municipalities. Government representatives and the opposition only agree on one point. The problem cannot be solved with money alone. The Bundestag Vice President Katrin Göring-Eckardt from the Greens asked Chancellor Olaf Scholz from the Social Democrats at the weekend for a permanent financial contribution from the federal government because of the cost of refugees with accommodation and integration. It is unacceptable that the federal chancellor has been wriggling about the question of how to proceed with the financing of the federal states and municipalities on this issue for months. That's what she told the newspapers of the Funke Media Group on Monday. And the Conservative Parliamentary Group also called for more money for the municipalities. They are the victims of the federal government's migration policy that was said by Parliamentary Secretary General Thorsten Frey on public television. The 2.75 billion euros earmarked for this year so far are clearly not enough because the challenges relate to integration overall, to daycare centers, schools, housing, and much more, he said. Some municipalities are now reaching their limits when it comes to housing and caring for refugees from Ukraine, plus asylum seekers from other countries. In their opinion, the lump sum of 2.75 billion euros promised by the federal government for 2023 is not enough, and the integration costs are not taken into account either. Scholz has invited representatives from the federal state and from the state governments and to a top-level meeting in the Chancellery on May 10th now. And Federal Interior Minister Nancy Faeser, also from the Social Democrats, does not want to be committed to municipalities getting more money. It's not always just about the financial issues, she said. One is in the process of creating additional accommodation options. Well, the federal states have already been offered federally owned real estate on several occasions as accommodation for asylum seekers and refugees, she said. And according to Faeser, the planned reform of the EU asylum system is to be negotiated as to whether refugees can be detained at the external border, in this case for almost 3 months, for the first part of the asylum check. They would wrestle with the other EU countries for the time. It's probably about 12 weeks, she said. We always have to make sure that it's humane and that we can deal with it. I think it's important to register and identify as early as possible so that we can have open borders in Europe. The EU states want to reform the non-functioning system of distribution and admission. It is possible to check immediately after registration in external border states whether someone has a chance of protection or not. In addition, it should be looked into which state the individual seeking protection should possibly travel to, for example, because close relatives live there. It's also being considered whether there should be exceptions to detention, for example, for people with disabilities or families with children. The German Institute for Human Rights spoke out against closed reception centers. A system that primarily relies on deterrence and the outsourcing of asylum checks to the external borders, or even supposedly safe third countries outside the EU, is incompatible with Germany's refugee and human rights obligations. That is what they said in a statement on Monday. The Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals had agreed on a common position for the negotiations on the reform of the common European asylum policy. Schleswig-Holstein's Minister of Integration Aminata Touré from the Greens told the newspaper Welt on Tuesday about considerations of having asylum procedures completed at the EU's external border in the future. I can't imagine how that should relieve the countries bordering the Mediterranean, and at the same time, decent accommodation should be achieved in countries that are already overwhelmed. In my opinion, this also contradicts the basic idea of German asylum law. And the CDU politician Frey emphasized, migration must be controlled and limited. In addition to European measures, there are also national measures, such as expanding the list of safe countries of origin to include the North African Maghreb countries and Georgia. That would help to speed up procedures and thus relieve the burden on the municipalities. So-called safe countries of origin are countries where it's generally assumed that there is neither political persecution or inhumane or degrading punishment or treatment. And this should enable faster asylum decisions and deportations. The old black-red federal government wanted to classify Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Georgia as safe countries of origin. The proposal passed the Bundestag in 2019, but did not progress in the Bundesrat because of resistance from states in which the Greens or the left are co-governing. And the Greens don't think much of a new push here. In addition to several politicians from the CDU and CSU, Brandenburg's Prime Minister Dietmar Woidke from the SPD also spoke out in favor of expanding the list of so-called safe countries of origin. That should finally happen now, is what he told the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I will propose that again to the coalition partners and the CDU and the Greens. The leaders of the CDU, of the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP discussed the coalition committee in a coalition committee with Chancellor Olaf Scholz about this. The overburdening of immigrants complained about by municipalities and states should also have been an issue there. And the states repeatedly complained that the capacities for accommodation and integration were exhausted and that these problems could not be solved with money alone. In view of the increased number of refugees, the federal states are also pushing for easier deportation of people without a right to stay in Germany. And it's also being discussed whether countries should be classified as so-called safe countries of origin, as I said before. And coalition circles said the SPD and FDP are currently relatively close when it comes to refugee policy. The Greens, on the other hand, focus primarily on financial aid for municipalities that were particularly burdened by accommodation and care. And as I said, we will see on May 10th, when the federal and the state governments discuss the distribution of the cost for the accommodation and care for asylum seekers and refugees again. In the case of deportations, responsibility lies not only with the federal states, but also with Interior Minister Nancy Faeser and the Special Representative for Migration Agreements Joachim Stamp. He's from the Liberals. The FDP wants Stamp to have something to offer his interlocutors in his forthcoming negotiations with states that should cooperate more in taking back their citizens who are required to leave the country. And this is probably one of the reasons why she is campaigning for the so-called Western Balkans rule, which provides for a quota for the entry of workers to be extended to other countries. According to the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, 80,978 people applied for asylum in Germany in the first quarter of 2023. Of these, 5,817 applications concerned children under the age of 1 year. Refugees from Ukraine do not have to apply for asylum in Germany or other EU countries, by the way, but are accepted via the so-called Mass Influx Directive. And in the first quarter, the federal police recorded 19,627 unauthorized entries. That is another issue, but it doesn't block them from applying for asylum, just to make that one clear, especially because of the discussions I always have to have on my main channel where I'm talking about the politics of the United Kingdom. The entry in many cases is illegal, true, but that doesn't prevent anyone from having the right to apply for asylum once they reach the country. How the result will be in the end depends on tons of factors. I made videos of that. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.